Hello everyone and a warm welcome back to our channel, a place where narratives aren't merely recounted but deeply resonated with. If you stand for compassion, rectitude, and authenticity, then you've certainly found your community. It's often said that time mends all wounds. But what if the scar is perpetually reopened, often by subtle, everyday occurrences that typically go unnoticed? Prejudice isn't always overt. It doesn't perpetually manifest in fiery symbols or vitriolic insults. Sometimes, it subtly manifests through hushed exclusion, deliberate evasion, and opportunities unjustly withheld. Some might dismissively suggest, "Oh, come on, things have progressed. Why dwell on this issue?" Others might counter, "Precisely because its current covert nature renders it more insidious than ever." Where do you stand on this? Before we delve into the complete narrative, please remember to engage with our content by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your engagement empowers us to amplify genuine voices, unfiltered truths, and vital discussions. Every interaction is significant and every narrative holds immense weight. Now let's commence. The atmosphere outside the New Orleans police precinct was thick with humidity, a stifling density that clung to every breath, imposing the city's oppressive weight upon one's very being. It was late afternoon, the thoroughfares subdued, save for the distant thrum of a transit vehicle a few blocks away. On the fissured pavement adjacent to the station, Verice Carter stood solitary, her posture erect, one hand resting upon her walking aid, the other tightly gripping a modest, weathered container. At 78, her movements were measured, each inhalation controlled, each gaze unwavering. Her time-worn military tunic, bearing the marks of extensive use, draped loosely over her slender frame. It wasn't a mere display, it was an intrinsic part of her, interwoven with memories of jungle gunfire and names indelibly etched into her soul, never having departed the battlefield. To most observers, she might have seamlessly blended into the background, a serene, elderly woman awaiting transportation in the imposing shadow of a police department. However, to Sergeant Bradley Kane, who descended the concrete steps, his boots resonating sharply against the ground, she represented something entirely different. Kane, in his late 30s, possessed a broad physique indicative of someone dedicated to physical prowess, and carried himself with an air of authority, accustomed to immediate compliance. His voice cut through the stillness like a sharp retort. "Lost, madam?" he inquired, though the query lacked genuine questioning intent. His tone carried that familiar proprietary edge, as if every segment of the vicinity belonged exclusively to him. His hand rested casually near his waist, his thumb hooked in a manner that caused his insignia to glint beneath the descending sun. Verice deliberately inclined her head with the composed demeanor of someone who had witnessed far greater displays of arrogance in official attire. "No, sir," she responded softly, her voice smooth yet deeply rooted like the earth itself, awaiting the 7. Kane scrutinized her as if her mere presence there was an affront. "This isn't a refuge," he murmured, his voice hardening. "We've received grievances regarding individuals loitering, bothering officers. Do you have any legitimate reason for being here?" Without uttering a word, Verice reached into her garment and produced her billfold. The action was precise, habitual, devoid of apprehension, yet deliberate. She opened it, revealing a faded veteran's identification, a driver's permit, and nestled behind them, the shimmer of a bronze star bearing her inscribed name. "I dedicated 34 years to serving this nation," she stated evenly. "If you invert that card, you'll observe my name engraved there, identical to the commendation." Kane briefly surveyed the identification but did not return it. His gaze lingered on the coat, the emblem, the bronze star. Rather than reverence, his lip curled. "Decorations don't grant immunity. You appear to be trouble in waiting." He casually flicked the identification back at her, allowing it to strike her palm with a distinct sound. "Why don't you depart before you find yourself in an undesirable situation?" Verice's breathing remained slow and steady. "With all due deference, young man," she fixed her gaze steadily on his, "I've endured worse insults from superior individuals." A passing adolescent on a bicycle decelerated, sensing the escalating tension. A woman across the thoroughfare drew her offspring closer, observing the unfolding scene. The air grew dense with a peculiar stillness that precedes an imminent rupture. Kane advanced, closing the proximity until the metallic glint of his insignia was mere feet from her visage. Allow me to inspect your pockets, he commanded, his voice imbued with an authoritarian tone. It was not an appeal. You lack any justifiable cause, Verice responded, her tone now resolute, imbued with the weight of decades of self-discipline. I am not under suspicion of any wrongdoing. Oh, so now you intend to instruct me on protocol? Kane snapped, his smirk broadening. Without awaiting a reply, he lunged forward, his hands roughly probing her coat until he located the diminutive metal container. He forcibly yanked it free. What is this? That is my Medal of Honor, Verice stated, a flicker of something more akin to resolve than apprehension passing through her eyes. Please don't. Kane allowed it to fall. The container struck the concrete with a sharp report, springing open. The metal within tumbled, rolled across the paving, and came to rest in a patch of earth beside the gutter. For a fleeting moment, time ceased. No one stirred. No one spoke. The muted sound of the metal settling into the dirt seemed more resonant than any shouted protest could have been. Verice's gaze tracked the metal, then slowly ascended, meeting Kane's eyes. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was serene and frigid, every syllable etched with the profound weight of recollection. I earned that by crawling through Inferno to retrieve 3 men who were no longer breathing. 2 of them survived. A few feet away, Officer Colin Hayes, a nascent patrolman recently graduated from the academy, felt a visceral churning in his abdomen. He had observed the entire exchange, his hand hovering near his belt radio, torn between adherence to regulations and the dictates of his conscience. But from the station portal, Sergeant Leonard Briggs materialized, gray-haired, keen-eyed, his demeanor inscrutable. He delivered a subtle headshake to Hayes, a cautionary signal. Stay uninvolved. The tension fractured. Turn around. Kane bellowed, his voice escalating for the now gathered small audience. Hands where I can see them. I have committed no offense, Verice stated, her voice firm but subdued. Turn around now. Kane shoved her, rotating her towards the wall. The restraints clicked around her wrists with a chilling finality, each metallic snap reverberating off the station's brick walls. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. What in the world are you doing? Someone exclaimed. She's a veteran, another voice cried out. Kane merely retorted, step back or you'll face charges of obstruction. Inside the precinct's reception area, Tasha Lewis, a young African-American receptionist, stood transfixed behind the glass partitions. Her heart throbbed as she raised her phone and initiated recording. She had witnessed numerous detentions but none quite like this. Not in broad daylight, not with someone resembling her grandmother being manhandled like a felon for merely awaiting a bus. 6 seconds. That was the entirety of her footage. 6 seconds of Verice being searched, apprehended, and forcibly directed towards the entrance. No exclamations from Verice, no resistance, just an eerie silence, and the image of her Medal of Honor lying forgotten in the street. Tasha preserved the video. Then she transmitted it to herself twice. Outside, the breeze carried a faint clink of the metal as it lay in the dirt, catching the last gleam of sunlight. Kane remained oblivious. Nor did Briggs notice. But the surveillance cameras positioned high on the station wall captured every moment, their red recording indicators blinking like silent, unwavering observers. What Kane and Briggs were unaware of was that the woman they had just confined to a holding cell wasn't merely another civilian, nor just another aging veteran. Verice Carter carried a burden far weightier than her service commendations. She possessed affiliations, authorizations, and a background that rendered her detention not just erroneous but utterly calamitous. The tempest was approaching, and by the time anyone comprehended the extent of their misdeed, it would already be beyond rectification. Because when such silence as hers remains unbroken, it signifies not feebleness but an admonition. Occasionally the most perilous tempests do not commence with thunder. They begin with a murmur, and that murmur had just reached the Pentagon. While Verice Carter remained in a detention chamber deep within the New Orleans police establishment, her hands loosely clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed upon a fissure in the concrete floor, a subtle alarm had begun to resonate hundreds of miles distant. It was not the kind of alarm that blared through sirens or flashing illuminations. It was the silent variant, a digital tremor propagating through encrypted networks, activating alerts that only a select few individuals in the nation possessed the authorization to perceive. Her designation, Verice L. Carter, had surfaced on a Tier 1 clearance database, marked with a textual annotation that most officers at that precinct could not even begin to comprehend. Federal detainment prohibited. Notify DoD command. Immediate response required. Back at the station, none of that held significance yet. Kane casually leaned against the processing counter, rotating Verice's impounded container on its edge as if it were nothing more than a trivial ornament. Sergeant Briggs stood nearby, arms folded, his jaw taut. To any other observer, Briggs might have appeared composed, even detached. But beneath that stillness, his intellect was racing. He had seen the communique that had materialized on his terminal merely 10 minutes prior. An automated system notification from a federal server demanding authentication of Verice's identity. It had arrived without elucidation, only with urgency. And in Briggs's extensive career he knew one immutable truth. Federal urgency never bode well for individuals like Kane, or for the department itself. In the passageway, Officer Colin Hayes lingered by the records archive, a gnawing discomfort twisting in his gut like a tightly drawn cord. He was not yet a paragon of heroism, but neither was he oblivious. The footage that Tasha Lewis had captured was already disseminating, local news outlets now featuring it. Veterans associations were demanding explanations, hashtags proliferating by the minute. Colin had observed the name Verice Carter trending alongside terms such as deference, equity, and probity. But what the world remained ignorant of, not yet, was that this was not merely an erroneous apprehension. This was a catalyst hurled into a volatile situation that could dismantle careers, departments, perhaps even the city's highest authority, should the critical specifics come to light. Because Verice was not solely an acclaimed veteran. She was not merely a woman who had been awarded her Medal of Honor for extricating wounded combatants from a kill zone in Vietnam. Her past, the one concealed behind strata of classified authorization, was far more profound. Following her retirement from active service, she had been engaged in a clandestine capacity for the Department of Defense, orchestrating intelligence liaisons across 3 continents, frequently in operations of such sensitivity that they were expunged from official documentation. Few living individuals even knew the full scope of her assignments. But those who did understood one crucial fact. Verice Carter was not to be interfered with. Not by local law enforcement, not by anyone lacking federal endorsement. In the detention cell, Verice still had not spoken. Not to the officers pacing beyond her confines. Not to the junior patrolman who had whispered an apology as he slid a paper cup of water beneath the bars. Not even when Kane sneered through the bars and muttered, still reticent, perhaps you've finally comprehended your rightful place. Her silence was not capitulation. It was strategic calculation. She had spent years among men like Kane, individuals who mistook their authority for an impenetrable shield against repercussions. She understood better than to offer explanations to someone incapable of genuine attentiveness. The only words she had uttered since her arrival were 5, delivered in a steady, almost ritualistic cadence to Briggs when he demanded her name, Verice L. Carter. Spell it correctly. Upstairs, Sergeant Briggs could not dispel the unease coiling in his stomach. He had dealt with countless challenging civilians, numerous so-called difficult cases, but something about Verice was distinct. Her composure was unsettling, certainly, but it was the message on his terminal that had perturbed him most. He found himself telephoning the district commander, his voice subdued. "We may have a predicament down here," he murmured. "Run the name Verice Carter through secure channels. Tier 1 clearance just pinged us, and I do not wish to find myself on the wrong side of this if it is what I suspect it is." The line fell silent for 5 seconds before the commander responded, "Remain where you are. Do not release her. Do not interrogate her further. And for the love of God, do not provoke her. I will make some inquiries." But Kane evinced no concern for protocol. He was pacing like a predator deprived of sustenance, his vexation intensifying with each passing second. As the protests outside grew louder, a crowd had begun to assemble, veterans in worn tunics, community figures, even local media, all drawn by the pervasive video Tasha had uploaded. The slogans were now commencing, "Justice for Carter. Honor our vets." Kane sneered as he peered through the blinds. "They'll shout themselves hoarse by morning," he muttered. "Then we'll all revert to business." In another section of the edifice, Colin Hayes harbored doubts. He had been quietly sifting through the records database, attempting to discern why the Pentagon had flagged a 78-year-old woman awaiting a bus. When he finally located what he sought, a partially redacted file, Verice's younger visage alongside former Secretary of Defense Harold Whitaker, in a photograph labeled Confidential Eastern Op 1983, his hands began to tremble. Beneath the image, a single line in stark, bold typeface sent a shiver down his spine. Subject holds lifetime federal exemption from local detainment. Any breach will trigger immediate DoD intervention. Hayes printed nothing. He closed the file, erased the access log, and proceeded directly to Briggs's office. "Sir," he stated, his voice lower than customary, "we must release her now before this escalates into something beyond our control." Briggs did not immediately reply. He merely regarded Hayes, then the drawn blinds where Kane stood observing the demonstrations outside. Finally, Briggs exhaled slowly, the burden of 2 decades in uniform weighing heavily upon his shoulders. "It is already something beyond our control," he murmured. "The question is, how much worse do we wish it to become?" Neither of them was aware that at that precise instant, a motorcade of dark SUVs was hurtling down the highway towards New Orleans, federal license plates gleaming in the diminishing light. Inside the lead vehicle, Director Jonathan Harper of the FBI's Special Oversight Division scrolled through Verice's personnel dossier on a secure tablet. He paused at a black-and-white photograph of her in uniform, standing before a jungle outpost with 3 other operatives, 2 of whom were now enshrined at Arlington. "If they so much as harmed her," Harper stated softly to the agents in the vehicle, "this will not merely be a censure. It will be a reckoning." Back in the holding cell, Verice finally stirred. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her hands loosely clasped as her eyes located the security camera in the corner. For the first time, she allowed her lips to curve into the faintest hint of a smile. Not because she felt secure, not yet, but because she recognized that the tempest she had anticipated had at last begun to gather. And when that tempest arrived, it would not merely purify the atmosphere. It would dismantle everything these officers believed they controlled. It commenced not with shouts but with a profound silence, so heavy it felt as though the very walls of the station were holding their breath. The protests outside had now swelled to hundreds, their chants faintly reverberating through the concrete corridors, but internally, every officer experienced a different kind of disturbance. The pounding in their chests, the oppressive sensation of something inexorably closing in. Sergeant Briggs stood at the end of the passageway, phone still in hand from his last communication with the district commander. He had received no direct answer, only a singular, disquieting directive: "Do not release her. Do not touch her again. Assistance is en route." But he could detect the tension in the voice on the other end. Assistance in this context did not signify rescue for the department. It implied survival for Verice Carter, and potentially ruination for all others involved. Verice remained motionless in the cell, her back erect, her gaze fixed on the opposing wall. She had requested no sustenance, had made no move to drink the water provided for her. Her stillness disconcerted Kane more than anything. He paced before the bars, his boots heavy against the tiling. "You believe maintaining silence renders you invulnerable?" he muttered, his voice dripping with resentment. "You are not exceptional. Merely another relic who presumes a few medals elevate her to royalty of the thoroughfare." His words echoed, but Verice did not flinch. It was not defiance. It was something colder, more ancient. A steadfastness Kane had never encountered. In the observation chamber, Colin Hayes stood monitoring the security feed. Every affront, every shove, every fluctuation of Kane's temper was being captured by 3 distinct cameras, all linked to a federal network Hayes suspected was already overseeing the station. He recalled the file he had seen, the words seared into his memory: "Federal detainment prohibited. Tier 1 clearance." He glanced at Briggs, who stood beside him, pale and rigid. "Sir," Hayes stated quietly, "if the federal authorities arrive before we take action, we are not merely witnesses, we are accomplices." Briggs did not respond. He did not need to. The tension in his jaw articulated everything he knew. It was already too late to extricate themselves cleanly. Outside, the multitude had grown restive. Veterans stood at the barricades, holding their service banners, their countenances hardened, unyielding. A news drone hovered overhead, its camera transmitting live to national broadcasts. And near the periphery of the crowd, Tasha Lewis stood, her phone still in hand. The viral video she had disseminated was now accumulating millions of views. She was no longer live streaming. Instead, she was capturing the ambience, the slogans, the escalating ire, the manner in which people were not simply demanding Verice's liberation but something grander. Something she could not yet precisely define. It was not solely about one individual. It was about every spectator who felt their own silence had gone unheard for too long. Then came the sound. Not the throng, not the station, but something sharper, more distinct. The subdued thrum of engines in perfect synchronicity. Down the main thoroughfare, a procession of dark SUVs materialized, slicing through the traffic like a blade. No illuminating lights, no audible sirens, merely velocity and precision. The crowd shifted, murmurs spreading as they observed the federal license plates and darkened windows. Briggs, observing from the upstairs window, felt his stomach plummet. "They're here," he whispered. Although no one in the room required being informed, Kane, oblivious to the approaching convoy, turned back to Verice's cell. His frustration had escalated into a reckless fury. "You believe this mob will rescue you?" he sneered. "They'll wail for a single night, and tomorrow you'll be just another forgotten headline." He stepped closer, leaning on the bars. "So why not abandon the charade? Disclose your true purpose for being here, and perhaps we can offer you a concession." For the first time, Verice's eyes shifted. Slowly, deliberately, she looked up at Kane, not with trepidation, not with resentment, but with a composure so acute it pierced his words like shattered glass. "Son," she stated, her voice steady, low, and commanding in a way that silenced even the distant hum of protests. "You possess no concessions to offer me, but you are about to desperately require one." The words hung in the air like a poised blade. Hayes, observing from the monitor, felt his pulse surge. He turned to Briggs, whose complexion had turned ashen. "Sir," Hayes reiterated, more urgently this time, "we must release her now." Before he could conclude, the structure vibrated with the impact of heavy footsteps striking the tiling. The reception area erupted in a surge of activity as the initial team of federal agents swept in, weapons holstered but hands poised, their mere presence sufficient to cause every officer in the room to freeze. Director Jonathan Harper entered last, his measured strides emanating a control that felt more menacing than any drawn weapon. He did not raise his voice as he addressed Briggs directly. "Where is she?" Briggs commenced to speak, but before he could respond, a shout resonated from the corridor. Kane, grasping the unfolding situation, had violently yanked open the cell door, gripping Verice's arm as if to forcibly extract her like a common suspect. "You are not departing from here as some hero," he snarled, his fingers digging into her sleeve. "Not while I'm—" The remainder of his sentence was severed by the thunder of footsteps behind him. In less than 2 seconds, 2 federal agents closed the distance, forcefully wrenching Kane backwards so rapidly he barely registered the flooring before it slammed against his spine. Verice stood unmoving, adjusting her sleeve as Harper stepped into the cell doorway. "Ma'am," Harper stated, his voice soft but unwavering, "you are at liberty to depart, and I assure you this matter will be addressed." Verice regarded him for a moment, her eyes scrutinizing his countenance for something unarticulated. Then, with a deliberate nod, she rose, her movements measured, almost ceremonial. As she stepped past Kane, still restrained on the ground, his breath ragged, she paused just long enough to meet his gaze. Not to exult, not to threaten, but with a quiet commiseration that struck harder than any verbal assault could have. The station was utterly silent as she proceeded towards the egress, flanked by federal agents. Outside, the multitude fell into a hush as the doors opened and Verice Carter emerged. Her posture unbroken, her gaze level, the evening sun catching the edge of the metal container still cradled beneath her arm. No speeches, no gestures, just presence. A presence that carried more weight than any vocal expression could. Harper turned to Briggs and Hayes, his expression unreadable. "You will both undergo questioning," he stated simply. "For now, stand down." He did not spare a glance for Kane, still subdued on the floor. "As for him," Harper added, nodding to the agents, "take him into custody. He will not be returning home tonight." As Verice stepped into the lead SUV, the murmurs outside swelled into a quiet, rising crescendo, not of animosity but of profound esteem. Banners were raised. Headwear was removed. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, their unity more resonant than any chant. And as the convoy departed, every observer understood that this was not the conclusion of the narrative. It was merely the moment the reckoning began to ignite. The storm had receded from the Jefferson County Police Precinct, but its reverberations had only just commenced to shake the nation. By dawn, every prominent news outlet possessed the footage. Verice Carter's composed egress flanked by federal agents, the awestruck reverence of the crowd, and the handcuffed figure of Sergeant Kane being led away. Headlines did not merely question what had transpired, they demanded why. And in Washington, where subtle indications carried more influence than outright declarations, the query was not whether justice would be served, but how profoundly it would cut when it did. Director Jonathan Harper stood in the war room at FBI headquarters, his reflection fragmented in the polished glass table. Before him, a series of dossiers lay open, documents extracted not solely from Jefferson County, but from neighboring departments, encompassing years of concealed grievances and missing records. Each page represented a crucial piece of evidence in a case Kane was yet to fully comprehend. But Harper's gaze was not solely fixed on Kane. It rested upon the supervisory personnel who had permitted the corruption to proliferate, the officials who had maintained silence, and the policies that had transformed silence into complicity. "This is not an isolated instance of a botched arrest," Harper stated quietly to his assembled team. "This is a structural issue and we are about to dismantle it." Meanwhile, Verice Carter resided in a secure residence on the outskirts of Savannah, her posture unyielding, even amidst the subdued hum of guarded solitude. She had spoken sparingly since her liberation, answering the federal agents' inquiries with precision but little elaboration. She was not concerned with personal vindication. She was awaiting the truth to assume its rightful form, not for her benefit, but for every individual whose name had been forgotten under comparable circumstances. Her silence, the very same silence that had sparked a national conflagration, had now become a potent instrument, sharpening the focus of investigators and inflaming a public disinclined to avert its gaze. Across the state, the repercussions began to manifest. Captain Briggs was summoned to provide testimony behind closed doors, accompanied by 2 legal representatives, visibly drained, his voice faltering as he conceded that he had been cognizant of Kane's escalating misconduct but had failed to intervene. Hayes, more composed but equally grave, submitted digital records from the station's internal systems, files demonstrating patterns of impropriety, falsified reports and internal warnings disregarded by command. Neither man offered an outright defense. Both appeared to grasp that their statements were no longer shields, but rather admissions of culpability. Then came the witnesses. Jed Connolly, his jaw still bearing a faint contusion from Kane's strike, took the stand in a preliminary hearing. He recounted not only the apprehension but also the culture that had facilitated it, the unstated rules of passive observation, the directives to remain silent, the apprehension of stepping out of line. His testimony reverberated outward, broadcast by every network, shifting the focus from Kane alone to the moral disintegration of an entire department. Tasha Lewis, the woman whose video had ignited it all, stood next. She did not bring animosity or theatricality. Instead, she held her phone and replayed the 6 seconds that had prompted millions of voices. "This is not merely about one man or one arrest," she stated softly to the cameras. "It is about how silence can be shattered, and once it is, nothing can remain concealed." The Department of Justice acted with unexpected swiftness. Within 72 hours, Jefferson County was placed under federal oversight, pending a comprehensive investigation. Harper's team announced a civil rights inquiry extending back over a decade, promising not only disciplinary measures but systemic reform. And beneath it all, a deeper current flowed. Documents had surfaced suggesting Kane's actions were part of a broader pattern, one that extended beyond a single precinct and into the networks of authority that had afforded him protection. For Verice Carter, the silence persisted. She issued no statements, nor did she grant interviews, even as the public clamored to hear from her. Instead, she chose her moment carefully one afternoon, standing before a small assembly of veterans and community members outside the courthouse. "Justice," she declared, her voice steady and unyielding, "is not an auditory phenomenon. It is a substantial force. And when it finally descends, it does not merely impact the culpable. It reshapes the very ground upon which we all stand. And as the crowd listened, the realization grew not of closure but of something more profound stirring, something that was poised to test not solely Jefferson County, but the very essence of how the nation chose to confront power. For the gavel had not yet descended. And when it did, the world would experience its reverberation. The courtroom was still, a stillness derived not from decorum, but from profound gravity. The immense weight of knowing that an irreversible event was imminent. Every seat was occupied, veterans with their commendations affixed to faded tunics, young activists clutching notebooks, and ordinary citizens who had witnessed a 6-second video and felt the allure of rectitude more powerfully than ever before. At the focal point sat Verice Carter, her hands neatly folded in her lap, her posture erect, her countenance inscrutable. She was not present for retribution. She was there for truth to complete its destined course. At the defense table, Sergeant Kane sat pale and rigid, no longer the imposing figure barking directives in Jefferson County, but a man divested of the perceived shield that had rendered him untouchable. His legal counsel whispered frantically, sliding documents and options before him. But Kane's gaze never lifted from the floor. He had known this day would arrive. Ever since Director Harper entered that precinct, ever since the cameras began rolling, ever since his authority, predicated on intimidation and arrogance, publicly disintegrated. The judge, a woman renowned for her deliberate pronouncements and stern demeanor, raised her eyes to address the court. "We are not solely convened here to render judgment upon an individual," she declared, her voice resonating through the still air. "We are here to acknowledge the profound breach of trust that rippled through a community and across this nation. Today is about accountability, not merely for Sergeant Kane, but for every system that permitted this moment to materialize." Her words struck with greater force than the gavel itself. One by one, testimonies echoed through the chamber. Jed Connolly, still bearing a faint scar from Kane's aggression, spoke of the climate of fear that had silenced him for so long, his voice trembling yet growing steadier as he recounted the day that irrevocably altered everything. Tasha Lewis replayed the viral clip one final time, allowing the silent dignity of Verice Carter to pervade the space where arguments and defenses had faltered. And when Director Harper stepped forward, presenting the meticulously compiled evidence of years of misconduct concealed by those who had worn the identical emblem as Kane, the room seemed to hold its breath. There remained no room for exculpation. When it was finally Verice's turn, she did not take the stand. She did not speak from the witness box. Instead, with the quiet determination that had ignited this reckoning, she stood beside her seat, her voice calm but firm. "This was never about me," she stated, her eyes sweeping the courtroom. "It is about how we ascertain the intrinsic worth of an individual. Not by their reticence, not by their age, not by the hue of their skin, but by the truth they embody, even when others would prefer not to perceive it. Justice is not about punitive measures. It is about equilibrium. And today we commence its restoration." Her words, simple as they were, seemed to settle into every recess of the room like a tide finally reaching its shore. The gavel descended once, the sound sharp and conclusive. Kane was sentenced to federal incarceration, stripped of his designation, his emoluments, and his insignia. But the pervasive sentiment in the room was not triumph. It was transformation. Outside, the multitude did not erupt in exultation. They stood united, quiet, observing as Verice emerged from the courthouse with Director Harper by her side. The sky above was a gentle gray, the kind of day that felt as though the world was holding its breath. Verice paused at the summit of the courthouse steps, briefly turned to the crowd and raised her hand, not in resentment, not in jubilation, but in a silent gesture of acknowledgement. The resonance that lingered was not in words, but in what followed, because as her hand lowered, the crowd began to rise, one by one, in a silence more profound than any roar. A promise that what commenced with one woman's quiet fortitude would not culminate in one man's downfall. And that silence, more than any pronouncement delivered, became the sound the entire nation would remember. The narrative of Verice Carter did not conclude in that courthouse. It commenced there. What originated as a silent indignity on a cold sidewalk outside a Georgia police establishment blossomed into a movement that extended far beyond Jefferson County. It became a profound reminder not merely of the injustices an individual can encounter, but of the transformative power a singular act of dignity can wield when the world resolves to cease its indifference. Verice's silence was never a demonstration of frailty. It was a formidable challenge, a revealing mirror, and an imperative call for others to define their own stance when confronted with stark reality. Her ordeal imparted a lesson more significant than mere indignation. It evinced that strength is not invariably measured by the vehemence of our struggle, but by the enduring resilience with which we can stand unbowed when the world endeavors to dismantle us. Sergeant Kane believed authority emanated from the weight of a badge, the prerogative of a uniform, and the capacity to instill fear. But Verice, without ever raising her voice, reminded us that true potency resides in fortitude, in the refusal to submit to cruelty, and in allowing justice rather than vengeance to utter the ultimate declaration. From Tasha Lewis, who possessed the audacity to capture and disseminate those 6 pivotal seconds that the entire nation would witness, to Jed Connolly, who found the courage to break his silence and confront his own tacit complicity, this narrative extends beyond Verice. It encompasses the transformative outcomes when ordinary individuals, faced with extraordinary injustice, elect to be more than mere spectators. It illuminates what transpires when silence, coupled with profound dignity, compels even the most powerful systems to yield. The enduring principle is straightforward yet crucial. Justice does not always bellow. Sometimes, it patiently awaits until the world can no longer disregard it. Verice's unwavering refusal to be broken served as a collective reminder that we need not always vociferate to be heard. Occasionally, our composure can shake the very foundations of injustice more profoundly than our rage ever could. Her valor compelled institutions to account for their failings, ignited reforms, and demonstrated to millions of Americans that dignity is an indomitable force capable of outlasting even the most profound manifestations of animosity. And now the pivotal question is not merely what transpired with Verice Carter. It is what unfolds next for all of us. Will we be the ones who avert our gaze when witnessing injustice? Or will we stand, articulate, and act even when it is uncomfortable? Will we recall that silence, when conjoined with truth and courage, can resonate more powerfully than any discourse? If Verice's narrative resonated with you, if it prompted introspection, inquiry, or a desire for change, do not allow it to conclude when this video ceases. Share this narrative so others can apprehend its gravity. Leave a comment to communicate which aspect lingered most profoundly with you, because every voice contributes to the collective harmony that ensures individuals like Verice are never again consigned to oblivion. And most critically, subscribe to our channel so we can continue to deliver the narratives that truly matter, the ones that cultivate our betterment, not merely our vociferousness. Because this is not merely another chronicle of injustice. It is empirical validation that courage, even in profound silence, can alter the trajectory of individual lives and societal structures alike. Together we can ensure that narratives like Verice Carter's are not just recounted, but perpetually advanced as a testament to our fundamental tenets: justice, dignity, and the inherent strength of standing tall, even when the world endeavors to subjugate us. So remain with us, like, share, and subscribe. Let us ensure that the next time the world attempts to silence someone like Verice, it is not merely her standing tall. It is all of us,